of 1984, the Ajayis flew to Lagos, as they always did for the summer holidays. They would spend 3 weeks with Uncle Kayode and his wife, using their home as a base from which to visit Mama and Remy, as well as other relatives in Lagos and Ibadan. In years past, visits to kinfolk were endless, but Uncle Bola and Uncle Joseph had now died, and many other relatives had moved away. Bisi was living in Ghana with her 3 children. She worked as an accountant in Accra. Auntie Bayo had also left Nigeria shortly after her divorce, which had been messy because of Uncle Kayode's affair with Hélène. Apparently, the affair had begun in 1963, not long after Uncle Kayode's marriage to Bayo. Tayo wondered sometimes how the relationship had started and what had made his uncle so sure about Hélène, and what had made Hélène so certain that Uncle Kayode wouldn't later find another woman to replace her. But these were not things one asked, not even to a heterodox like Uncle Kayode. Uncle Kayode had left the Nigerian army shortly after the Biafran War and gone to France, just as he'd said he would, to complete his engineering training. Tayo presumed that it was during this time that his uncle lived with Hélène in France and then returned with her to Nigeria after his studies. They were married in 1974 and moved from the old house in Yaba to Victoria Island. Uncle Kayode held a senior position with the oil conglomerate Elf, while Hélène worked from home as an artist. For a few years, Miriam had refused to stay with Uncle Kayode out of a sense of loyalty to Auntie Bayo, who had been her mentor at nursing school. But with time, Miriam, like the rest of the extended family, came to love Hélène. Hélène was one of those rare expatriate women who embraced Nigeria and adopted its cultures to the point where it was easy to forget she was French. She even spoke English with a Yoruba accent, rather than a French one. Often, when Tayo was with Hélène, he thought of Vanessa and allowed himself to fantasize about what things might have been like had he and Vanessa been living happily together. The house was a 5-minute walk from the ocean, and it was such a striking building that it had once featured in a design magazine under the headline, "Beauty in the Heart of Darkness." Uncle Kayode disapproved of the caption, but it obviously hadn't annoyed him enough to stop displaying several copies of the article throughout the house. Like most properties in the most expensive part of Lagos, none of the beauty was visible from the outside. A 10-foot-high concrete wall laced with loops of barbed wire encircled the house, hiding it from public view. Even when the guards let people through the imposing steel gates, little of the actual house could be seen from the front. Leafy palm trees and thick bougainvillea obscured the building. Always when they arrived at the Ogundeles, Kemi would announce that this was the sort of house she wanted when she grew up. And because the Ogundeles had no children of their own, they spoilt her. "When I have a house, it will be just like Auntie Hélène's," Kemi would say. "Maybe not so big, but it will have lots of art." And there was certainly an abundance of art in the Ogundeles' home, which sometimes reminded Tayo of the Barker's home in Oxford. Hélène, like Edward, had collected paintings from around the world, as well as sculptures and bronzes from across West Africa. On this visit, as a special treat for Kemi, Hélène had invited 2 local artists to the house to talk about their craft. One was a carver and the other a bronze sculptor. Kemi had been thrilled, and Tayo had watched with amusement as his daughter badgered the artist with questions. The carver, a man by the name of Akin, had brought a small collection of his works, including some statuettes of former colonial officers. The inspiration for these, he explained, came from a great-uncle who enjoyed telling stories, particularly about his former boss, named Lugard. When Tayo heard this, he could hardly contain his excitement. Might this be Lord Lugard? Many books had been written on the legendary British High Commissioner to Nigeria, but never from the perspective of Nigerians who knew and worked with him, so if this old man could still remember stories, that was very exciting. When Akin offered to take Tayo to see the uncle, Tayo jumped at the opportunity. Miriam was less keen, complaining that Tayo was not spending enough time with them, but Tayo argued that this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that he wasn't going to miss. Besides, since the uncle was an old man, he might not have long to live. "And isn't your mother also old?" Miriam retorted, reminding him that his trip would delay their planned visit to Ibadan. "But what difference does a day or 2 make?" Tayo would not be dissuaded. The next day, Tayo set off with Akin on the 4-hour drive to the old man's village of Atin. They left early in the morning, avoiding the worst of the traffic and the accompanying street vendors who stuck to cars like magnets, thrusting everything from boxes of rat poison to French perfumes through open windows in hopes of a sale. As they drove out of Lagos, beyond the lagoon, the landscape changed to one of dense rainforest, which gradually thinned as they progressed northward. It was the rainy season, and mounds of rich red earth lay by the side of the roads. For miles around, the landscape showed no sign of habitation. Only a few people walked along the side of the road, some of them children who waved excitedly at the passing cars. What a beautiful country, Tayo thought, admiring the vast open space. They drove by roadside bukas that sold bushmeat and firewood, and once they stopped to buy some peanuts and dodo ikire, which they ate in the car as they continued their journey. The drive was peaceful, except for the occasional crazy driver who would overtake on bends. Mostly, these were lorry drivers transporting farm produce, some of which would drop off the sides of the trucks as they sped by. The vehicles sported popular phrases painted on the back and sides in bright, florid letters, large enough for even the short-sighted to read. Allah saves, Jesus saves, the Almighty saves, as if this would guarantee them safe passage. Akin was playing some juju music on the crackly car radio, and after a while they began to speak of Akin's plans to move to Europe. He intended to spend just a day in the village before driving on to Ilorin for an exhibition of his work, with the hope of meeting a rich European or American sponsor. They arrived at the village in the middle of the day, when the sun was fierce and people sought shade from their work in the fields. The old man had gone out, so Akin went to find him, leaving Tayo to wait. He sat on the grass beneath a tree, drinking warm Coca-Cola and eating shelled groundnuts given to him by the woman of the house. After a while, some young boys returned from school and started playing football close to where Tayo sat. They used Sprite bottles as goalposts, just as Tayo remembered doing as a child. He remembered having to wake up early when the cock crowed to do his chores around the house, then bathe and eat. In those days, everybody walked to school, so they needed a hearty breakfast that their mothers cooked. Sometimes it was porridge or beans with yam, or sometimes akara and ogi. If it rained, father would drive them to school in his Morris Minor. Otherwise, they went by foot along city paths and across the Ogunpa River. During the rainy season, Tayo remembered that the river would sometimes rise so high they'd have to remove their shoes and school uniform, place them in a canvas bag on their heads, and then wade through the water that was occasionally chest-high. School ended early in the afternoon, as it apparently still did, since these boys were out playing. Perhaps they also stopped at roadside bukas on their walk home to buy refreshments, groundnuts, oranges, and coconut milk, before coming home to play football. As Tayo continued to watch, he thought of his future son and felt remorse for being impatient with Miriam. Pregnant women were entitled to be irritable, and he shouldn't have dismissed her concern for his mother. How many husbands could boast, as he did, of a wife that loved and cared for a mother-in-law just as much as she loved her own mother? He would apologize when he got back, and now, as he waited, he picked up a twig and drew a grid in the sand with 3 headings: F for family, W for work, and O for other. Beneath F, he wrote the word time. Despite all his denials to Miriam, he knew that he'd been spending too many hours working and not enough at home. There were also other things to change. He had fallen into a bad habit of cutting Miriam out of discussions by referring to topics or people with whom she was not familiar. He did it as a way of asserting his intellectual interests because Miriam rarely asked about them. But he knew that to talk above her, to simply make her more aware of what she didn't know, was not the way to solicit interest, and certainly wasn't strengthening their relationship. No doubt there were also things she would like to share with him. Perhaps, for her sake, he ought to make an effort to attend church again. This way, there would be more that they shared in common. Perhaps it might make him less nervous about growing old with her, and even if it didn't, it would surely be good for the children. Children were, after all, the one thing he and Miriam did share in common, and always would. On the work front, things were going well. Being chair of the Department of History was a considerable achievement for someone his age. He was proud of his staff and of the projects he'd started, but he still needed to find ways of limiting his administrative duties in order to devote more hours to research. Other. What should he write here? He should, perhaps, increase his physical activities now that he'd officially entered middle age. And then there was the perennial question of what he'd achieved at the supposed halfway point of his life. In one sense, he knew he had every reason to be proud of his achievements, but he was chair of a department that was chronically understaffed. As a result, neither he nor his colleagues had been able to make their mark as scholars in the wider world of academia. The government had promised a review of higher education, but these were empty promises. His old college friend, Ike, worked in the Ministry of Education, but even he hadn't been able to accomplish much. When Tayo had last seen Ike, he had challenged his old friend on why there had been such little progress. Ike had refused to discuss his party's policies and had accused Tayo of having unreasonable expectations. But it was Ike, as far as Tayo was concerned, who'd lost his way. Tayo was still thinking of Ike when Akin returned with the uncle. The uncle was indeed elderly and looked frail, but he had a youthful twinkle in his eye, as one might expect of a storyteller. Greetings were exchanged, and soon others from the village arrived to sit with them. They talked about the village and the season's crops, while the women pounded yams and washed pots nearby in preparation for the evening meal. A bowl of water was brought for the men to rinse their hands, and then 2 large steaming plates of pounded yam and egusi soup were placed in front of them. The men took turns, rolling balls of yam between their fingers and dipping them in the stew, which had large pieces of chicken resting at the bottom of the clay pot. More meat than usual, Tayo guessed, in his honor as their guest. They ate by the light of 2 kerosene lamps that attracted flying ants, which folded their wings and began crawling around the base of each light. Once the meal was finished, Tayo hoped to ask the uncle some questions, but the old man had started a game of ayo with his friends, and it was soon time to sleep. Tayo resigned himself to waiting until the next day, and went to sleep recalling all that he could from a recent publication of Lugard's diaries. The next morning, Tayo was keen to resume where they'd left off, but by then word had spread to a neighbouring village that a professor had come, and visitors besieged the house. Men and women came with their children, or photographs of children, wanting to see what the professor could do to guarantee them places in universities. There was little Tayo could do except show interest and concern, and by the end of the day he was exhausted. He wished that Ike and all the other government officials could see the desperation in these people's faces. Their only hope lay in the future of a son or daughter, and that was tenuous. Tayo tried not to be downhearted, but it was hard not to despair when it was his generation, the generation of Nigeria's independence, that was failing the country. Tayo still had not spoken with the old man, nor had he contacted his family to tell them he would be returning later than planned. But he was not concerned about the latter. Delays were always to be expected. No news is good news, Mama used to say. Eventually, on the 3rd day, Tayo found a way of walking alone with Akin's uncle. Occasionally the old man spoke in Yoruba, but his preference was English in a way that reminded Tayo of his own father. He spoke in a formal and somewhat stylized English, with a penchant for the phrase, "You follow." "So, what shall I tell you about my old boss, Lord Lugard?" The old man smiled. "I can inform you that I commenced employment with my boss in the year of 1912. You know that was the time when Oga returned to Nigeria after being governor in Hong Kong. You follow?" "Yes, sir," Tayo nodded. "But even before the time whereby I started employment with Lord Lugard and Lady Lugard, my father was in Lord Lugard's service before me. Baba was the one who accompanied Lord Lugard to Borgu to claim it away from the French. You follow?" "Yes, sir," Tayo nodded, bemused by the man's obvious admiration for his old boss. Tayo wondered, as the man continued recounting his stories, how much of his English had been learnt from Lugard. Sometimes he would ask my advice on government matters, especially if there were no other white people around. That was when he would ask us questions. Tayo nodded, finding this particularly interesting, as it was a side of Lugard not reflected in the diaries. "And I'll tell you something else," the old man smiled. "My boss liked our women." "Ah," Tayo smiled. "Is that so?" "Oh yes," the old man grinned. "He used to ask my father to find him some good women, and to this day there are some half-caste people in Nigeria who come from him." Tayo laughed, his head now filled with additional questions about Lugard. As the man spoke, Tayo also found himself thinking of his mother. The more he listened to old people, the more he realized how little he knew of Mama's life. He thought of Vanessa, too, and how good she must now be at these sorts of interviews. The walk had taken them around the old man's fields, and they were now retracing their steps. "I have one more thing to show you," the old man said, as they approached the house. He disappeared into a back room, and emerged, minutes later, with purple material draped over his arms. Tayo thought he was bringing church robes, but then, as he drew closer, he peered in amazement at what lay in front of him. It was Lugard's official robe, the one Lugard was known to have detested wearing for meetings with local dignitaries, but had been required to wear by His Majesty. "Keep the robe safely," Tayo urged, "and don't let any British museum take it from you. Whatever someone offers to pay, you can be sure it won't be enough." By the time Tayo left the village, 3 nights had passed, and he looked forward to returning to the Ogundele's home to rest. Sleeping rough on dirt floors and bathing in cold water had taken its toll, and he dozed in the back seat. He dreamt of a proper bed, 24-hour air conditioning, and the sauna that awaited him in the luxury of Uncle Kayode's home. The beautiful heart of darkness, Tayo smiled to himself. He would shower and then sit outside in the gardens next to the pool. Or perhaps he would retire to their guest cottage and lie with Miriam. Perhaps she would be in the mood to make love, but that was rare these days. Even when she hadn't been pregnant, their love-making had grown infrequent, with the exception of those days of hoped-for fertility, and how he hated the precision with which she made love then. For the rest of the time, her excuse was tiredness. Even on holiday, she seemed to have little desire for him. Perhaps it was biological. He knew he was not the only husband to suffer from a wife's abstinence, yet he didn't go further afield to feed his physical desires as others did. He'd considered it, but never wanted to risk it, more for Kemi's sake than for anything else. He'd already made these mistakes in his youth. He dozed off again and dreamt of Helen's cooking, and then Helen turned into Vanessa, and the house was no longer in Lagos, but in Dakar. He was lying with Vanessa in the guest cottage and kissing her when the dream stopped. The car had broken down. Several more hours were spent stuck by the side of the road in the stifling heat, waiting for the vehicle to be repaired. Eventually, when they set off again, Tayo stayed awake for the rest of the journey, knowing that in the dark he would have to direct the driver to the house. At least they'd managed to avoid the worst of Lagos traffic. But as they got closer, Tayo was surprised to see the gates wide open and cars parked everywhere, inside and outside. Was Uncle Kayode holding some sort of meeting or party at his home? Was someone ill? Had someone died? One of the guards ran to the car. "Ogasa!" "What is it?" Tayo asked, quickly opening his door and ignoring the driver's demand for the money that he was owed. Miriam was running towards him from the house, with Brother Remy beside her. "Where have you been since Monday? We've been trying to contact you," she shouted. "Mama is dead," she sobbed. "Mama?" The words reeled in his head as he gripped Miriam's arm for support. "Where were you?" she sobbed. "Everyone was trying to find you." In keeping with Muslim tradition, the family had buried Mama's body within 24 hours, not waiting for Tayo to return. But they delayed the funeral party for him, as well as for others returning to Ibadan from overseas. The grieving had taken place at the burial, but the party would be a chance to celebrate Mama's life. Now that Tayo had returned, the party could be arranged, and he and each of his brothers and sisters would prepare food in Mama's house and serve it to the guests who would arrive throughout the day. Miriam had already chosen the special ashoebi for the family to wear, which bore a picture of Mama. Musicians would come, and they would write a song for Mama, singing her praises and reflecting on the life she'd lived, as well as on her good fortune to be blessed with many children. There would be dancing, but Tayo would not dance. Mama had died on her way to Lagos. That Sunday night, she had asked her driver to take her there, and as they made their way on the darkened highway, they hit a pothole and the driver lost control. Nobody knew what had made Mama travel to Lagos at night, and Tayo blamed himself, even when Uncle Kayode took him aside and urged him not to. Over and over again he replayed the events of those days in his head. If only he had not listened to the conversation with Kemi and the artists, he would never have been tempted to leave. If only he'd listened to Miriam. If only he'd put family first. It didn't help when people told him not to blame himself. The more they told him this, the more he did. Chapter 24. 6 months after Mama died, the coup that most Nigerians were expecting came to pass. All across the nation, heavy glass frames were taken down from walls and pictures of the president were updated. Out came the man in white civilian robes, and back went the green military fatigues. White and green, Nigeria's colours. This routine was well known by now, and would grow all too familiar in the years to come. But at first people celebrated the return of a strong military that promised to stamp out corruption. At that time, anything promised to be an improvement upon the nation's failed experiment with democracy. Soon the optimism vanished, however, and university students took to the streets in protest. Months turned into a year, and with each successive wave of discontent, students demonstrated, campuses were closed, people were arrested, and some died during the protests. Many professors tried to stay out of the fray, but Tayo empathized with his students and refused to be intimidated. He vowed that as long as he lived, he would work to make things better, even if it meant giving clandestine assistance to student activists, which he did whenever students demanded explanations for controversial government policies. Armed with their professors' notes, the students wrote convincing arguments against government plans, printed them on flyers, and plastered them all over campus. For Tayo, it became a surreal existence, leaving no time to focus on his academic research. His days were spent either with students or in his office preparing documents, such as the one he worked on now for the British Council Conference. The theme of the conference was the future of Nigerian universities, and the point that Tayo wished to convey was simple. Universities were collapsing, and urgent help was needed from the government. The challenge was how to frame his message in such a way as to be taken seriously by government officials, as well as by donor agencies likely to be in attendance. Tayo was tired of walking a diplomatic tightrope in front of his nation's army officers, many of whom were half his age. But what else could he do? If the army officials perceived that he was criticizing them, they would become recalcitrant, and then little progress would be made, not to speak of the possible personal danger it might put him in. And so, without explicitly allocating blame, Tayo intended to address the real and potential danger brought to a nation's economy by dysfunctional universities. He placed the lid on his fountain pen, squeezed it shut, and stood up, ready to rehearse his speech when he heard a knock. "Are you busy?" It was Miriam. "Look at you," Tayo exclaimed, admiring the results of his wife's hair appointment, which he knew must have taken several hours in the salon. The fine black braids hung in a perfect semicircle around the back and sides of her head. "You look beautiful, my darling. No cooking tonight. I'm taking you out." He was about to suggest Hill Station, for a special meal and a romantic night when she interrupted and asked if he knew who else had decided to leave the country. Who? Tayo inquired cautiously, knowing that with each new departure, Miriam became more convinced that they should also leave. The Gordons. Really? Is this to go and look after her parents? No, she has sisters in England. Maybe her siblings aren't too responsible, he replied, tapping the desk impatiently with his notes. Even Kwame is leaving, Tayo. Well, I always suspected he was bogus, always running away from problems, Tayo replied, curtly, irritated by the direction of Miriam's conversation. He didn't like her using the examples of others to try changing his mind. Tayo, all our friends are leaving. The Adewoles, the Wisemans, the Shahs, even your beloved writers, Shoyinka and Achebe, have left. Everyone is going, yet still we stay. Why? She stepped away from the door, planting both hands on her hips. Tayo shook his head, quietly placing his notes back on the desk. Why now, Miriam, he thought. It was an important speech. Why couldn't she just allow him to finish it? In the old days, Miriam used to listen to him. She'd look up to him, trusted his judgment, but not anymore. Omo Tayo, look, just go and look in the kitchen. There's no rice, no bread, no eggs, no sugar. Miriam spoke quickly, rapidly ticking off the items one by one on her fingers. There's nothing, nothing. You can't even teach because of rioting and strikes. Miriam, please, he pleaded, watching as she raised her hands above her head and shook them in a gesture of despair. We've discussed this so many times before. Times are hard, but we can't all run away. It's not just the students. I also have responsibilities to the union. And responsibilities to us? What of your responsibilities to your wife, to your child, to our relatives? She did not mention her nephews by name, but he knew what she was thinking. It was one of those issues that they would never resolve. He was doing all he could to support both extended families, as well as so many of his students, but she didn't see it this way. She wouldn't even let him finish explaining. The hospital hasn't paid me for months, she interrupted. And you? When did the university last pay you? When was the last time lecturers received a salary? When was the last time you were given a sabbatical, or even a little money to present work at your beloved international conferences? But it's not about pay, he struggled not to raise his voice against hers. Isn't it? So when are you going to start driving a taxi or selling dodo and gari in the market just like your colleagues in order to support us? And what happens when Kemi school is closed? All the time you're thinking only of your students, or of the past. Tayo brought his fingers to his temples. Her nagging and shouting were like a scene from television straight out of Village Headmaster. Why couldn't they just have calm, reasoned discussions? Miriam, you know it won't come to this. You know that the money from my books provides for us. And that's supposed to last forever? Omo Tayo, why can't we move? Just for a short time at least until Kemi is settled. You could be writing abroad, teaching abroad. You could even influence things here at home more by being out of the country. But you get so obsessed, as though you're married to this cause. Miriam, I can't go yet, not yet. Look, I'm trying to write this speech to show the government what has happened to the universities. Everything is crumbling and this is our last chance. We can't let our country sink into self-destruction. It's our last chance, don't you see? Just look at the state of the universities. Ever since 1974, the budget for higher education has fallen, yet the number of universities has been expanding. Is it any wonder that... Why? She interjected. Why? Because they're following IMF guidelines and... I'm not talking about that. I don't care about IMF, World Bank, whatever. All I want to know is why can't you move? Remember what you said when Buhari came to power? What did he achieve? It was a bloodless coup, Miriam, he replied, wishing she didn't always have to bring it to this with her drama and her shouting. And a successful war against indiscipline. You remember how the neighborhoods were clean? People queued up in an orderly fashion and arrived at work on time and... Oh, Tayo, what are you talking about? Listen to me. I'm not your student. I don't care about that. Well, you should care. And you asked me the question. What question? I didn't even ask you to tell me about Buhari. Yes, you did, Tayo sighed, just waiting now for her to start crying to make him feel guilty. I asked why you couldn't leave this place. Miriam, how can you expect me to walk away from everything, from my work, my students, our country, and establish myself abroad? Why not? She shouted, clasping her hands above the braids and squeezing her face between her elbows. Tayo shut his eyes, and in that moment despised her. Look, I belong here, Miriam. These are the things I care about and must fight for. I don't have any other choice. And you think Babangida is suddenly going to change his mind on the adjustment program? Miriam let go of her head and shook her hands angrily in the air. No, but I'm more useful here than abroad. Everyone is running away. I'm not going to join them. And you believe these military men won't touch you because you're a professor, chair of history, and a big Oxford man? Look at what they did to Delegiwa. Miriam, please, he begged, walking towards her. No, don't touch me. Don't touch me. There's nothing for us here. We're wasting our time. And if it weren't for you and for your stubbornness, if it weren't for that, if we'd left earlier, we wouldn't have lost the baby. Miriam, He tried pulling her gently towards him. "Miriam, you know we don't know that." She too had heard the doctors say that the chances for such a premature baby would have been slim anywhere in the world. Still, she insisted that access to first-world equipment would have saved the child. At the very least, had she not been living under so much daily stress, she would not have gone into early labor. He stroked her arms and kissed her gently on the forehead. "You've never been good at moving," she sighed, pulling away, and with that she rubbed out all the goodwill and love that he was trying to show her. "Didn't we relocate here to Jos because of you?" he shouted. "Wasn't it you who argued that Jos would be better for the family? A more temperate climate than Ibadan, a good international school for Kemi, and on and on and on. Moving wasn't my choice, and you know that. I moved for you." "You make it sound like a sacrifice." "Damn you, Miriam. I've always sacrificed for you from the very beginning. Have you forgotten who stuck with you when you fell pregnant? I didn't blame you. I didn't leave when you lost the baby, so don't talk to me about sacrifices." "You're telling me about sacrifice? How dare you?" "Miriam, look, I'm sorry. I just..." But she wasn't listening. She slammed the door, sending his neat stack of notes flying. One sheet escaped and fluttered off the desk, skimming his bare foot. He reached down for it and shook off the coating of harmattan dust before scrunching it into a ball and tossing it angrily at the door. What was wrong with the woman? Wasn't it good enough that he'd promised to stay for just another year? Why did it always have to be so difficult? Chapter 25. Tayo sat at the hill station bar, remembering a night early in his marriage when he and Miriam had come here for drinks before going to the Chinese restaurant next door. He remembered sharing hot spring rolls and each of them claiming to be better than the other with chopsticks, when in fact neither of them had managed to bring food to their mouths without it falling off the sticks first. They'd laughed a lot that night, like new lovers, and then went home to make love, so passionately that it had given him hope. But that was then. Now, Kemi and Miriam had left him for a life in England. Tayo sighed, pushing aside the saucer of groundnuts and shaking his head to the offer of another beer. Music pulsated from speakers half hidden by fat bottles of Bacardi and Scotch, and the barmen sang along to the tune that Tayo recognized. "Who's this artist?" Tayo asked. "Michael Jackson, sir," the barman answered. Tayo nodded. Yes, it was Kemi's music, although now that he was a frequent visitor to bars, perhaps it was more accurate to say that 1990s pop songs had also become his music. He presumed Kemi still listened to Mr. Jackson, but that too might have changed. Two businessmen sat next to Tayo, sipping their lagers and debating, in hushed tones, the likely pros and cons of starting an import-export business. Tayo guessed they were speaking quietly so that no one could swipe their ideas. But at times their excitement seemed to get the better of them, and Tayo caught snatches of conversation. One believed in importing electric generators on the basis of predicted increased power shortages. This begged the question, how could Nigeria's Electrical Power Authority possibly get any worse? Already NEPA was off more than on, and hence the joke, never expect power always. "By 1994, I'm telling you," the man exclaimed excitedly, wagging an index finger in front of his friend's nose. "I'm telling you that so many people, in fact, I can even say 90% of Nigerians will be begging for generators." The friend seemed unconvinced, arguing instead for the importation of Mercedes-Benz spare parts and the export of Nigerian curios and thorn carvings. Tayo smiled sadly to himself at what their conversation suggested about a country in which continuing chaos and greed were taken for granted. Had father still been alive, he would have been shocked. Father had always thought that the best investments were in land, so much so that Tayo remembered this featuring in their last conversation. They had been touring the family farm, walking slowly because of father's weakened state, past the rows of maize, yams, and sweet potatoes. Tayo missed his father. Now there was no one older and wiser to look for advice. But perhaps it was better that father had not lived to see his country fall apart while the rest of the world emerged from the tyranny and fear of the Cold War. Of course, there were always a few things Nigerians could feel proud of. Soyinka had won the Nobel Prize. Okri had claimed the Booker. And father would certainly have enjoyed all the sporting successes. Who could forget that splendid African Cup final of 1980 when the Green Eagles creamed Algeria 3-0? But such glories could not compensate for all that was wrong with the nation, and it wasn't just Nigeria, but the whole continent that seemed to be suffering. Tayo looked wearily beyond the bar to the open doors leading to the pool. The sky was a dark backdrop for thunder and menacing claps of lightning. Outside, families were hurriedly gathering their towels and belongings before the first raindrops. Waiters dashed about, collecting abandoned deck chairs before sprinting back through the bar to the main foyer. Some of the guests would be staying at the hotel, but many, a mix of Africans and Europeans, would be locals visiting for the afternoon, the way Tayo used to come with Miriam and Kemi. He watched people running from the rain and spotted a teenage girl whose confident stride reminded him of Kemi. He smiled at her, but she didn't see him or else had been taught to be wary of strangers. All day long it had been like this, one event after another, causing him to seriously doubt the wisdom of staying on while his family had left for England. It began in the morning with the broken water pump, which the mechanics insisted could not be fixed without spare parts from China. The next headache came when the houseboy announced that he would be returning home to Kafanchan for the burial of a relative. Then, as if this were not enough, Tayo had just wasted precious time with Mr. Peters. The meeting with Mr. Peters had come about after Simon wrote to Tayo at the beginning of the year. Tayo hadn't been in touch with Simon since their Oxford days, but Simon had kept abreast of Tayo's news through the Balliol record. When Simon was appointed chairman of a prestigious London foundation, he'd contacted Tayo, and Tayo had, in turn, been thrilled to receive the letter with its mention of possible funding for his university. Foundations generally marched to the tune of the World Bank and IMF, arguing that what Africa needed was vocational and not academic education. So Simon's foundation offered fresh hope. Contacts were eagerly established, and arrangements made for Mr. Peters, Simon's Africa director, to visit Nigeria. In preparation for the meeting, Tayo had put together all the relevant papers and statistics. He'd even turned down an invitation to travel to New York, where he was to receive an award for his new book. And this was all for the sake of a meeting which turned out to be a waste of time. Why had the man even bothered to come over when his mind was already made up about any donations the foundation would make? He'd offered Tayo second-hand books, none of which were requested by the university, as well as old software programs that were useless without the computers the university desperately needed. Tayo leaned against the bar, reflecting on the fact that he'd stayed in Nigeria in order to help the university and his students. Yet in reality, he had provided little help. Last month, he'd received a suitcase full of cash from an anonymous source, urging him to stop complaining about government policies. He had refused the bribe, but now the threats were less veiled. Tayo glanced at his watch, waiting for his students to arrive, and wondering what he would tell them. He would have to admit that he'd been misled into believing that the foundation would support their graduate study. Tayo pushed his seat a little further from the bar for a better look outside, and saw that the rain had stopped. Workers were busy wiping the plastic deck chairs dry and covering them again in green slipcovers. With no guest outside, the men sang loudly, clicking their fingers and rolling their shoulders to Bob Marley singing, "Baby, don't worry about a ting." Tayo swiveled on his stool to look back inside. Behind the bar was a recessed lounge with leather seats and poufs, a more comfortable area to drink and chat. Tayo noticed 2 Lebanese men with Nigerian women, many years younger than them. The girls wore miniskirts and strapless tops, and were, he guessed, probably prostitutes. Why else would they be with overweight, middle-aged men? It was simply a question of economics and the amount of cash that could be extracted. His gaze lingered, and then returned to the woman he had noticed first, who sat on her own, drinking a Fanta. She was white and wore a tie-dyed dress and sandals that marked her as either someone who lived in Jos and dressed in the way of the locals, or perhaps a tourist. She was reading when one of the waiters approached her and stood before her with his tray held loosely in one hand behind his back. In the background, Marley was now singing about not waiting in vain for love. Tayo smiled at the irony, or perhaps the setup, as the woman looked up. She tucked her hair behind her ear, and Tayo saw that she was younger than he'd initially thought. Young and beautiful, the way he remembered Vanessa. The waiter hovered, but when the woman returned to her book, he took his cue and left. She wore a wedding band, which made Tayo wonder whether her husband was Nigerian or European. There were not many Anglo-Nigerian couples around these days. Most had divorced or left the country. Again, Tayo thought of Vanessa. He drummed his fingers on the cardboard beer mat and nodded to the new beat. It was Fela's famous Lady, in praise of the African woman's ability to follow her man, dance and show respect, rather than donning modern independent ways. The beat was catchy, and the lyrics provocative. Vintage Fela. Tayo had never taken the words of the song seriously, but today, because he was thinking about women, he gave it more thought. His own African woman had not always followed him, and he had never demanded that Miriam do so. Or had he? Certainly, when they first met, she had been more eager to please him than in later years. Perhaps, subconsciously, he thought that Miriam would strike a perfect balance between the modern and the traditional, in a way that had never been guaranteed with Vanessa. But in the end, she had done her own thing anyway. He sighed wearily, wishing he could see Vanessa again, just for old time's sake. If she came to Jos, he would show her all the scenic spots, the reservoir, the marketplaces, the rocky outcrops of Sherry Hills, and of course, Jos Museum. He imagined that she would enjoy explaining the significance of the art to him, and he would marvel at her knowledge. They would eat at the Bite of Benin, hands touching beneath the tablecloth, and they might even stay here in Hill Station's guest rooms, which always looked charming from the outside, small cottages with wooden beams. Tayo pictured the rooms with large beds, white linen, and soft feather pillows. Perhaps the rooms also had plush carpeting, air conditioning, and maybe even a fireplace for the cooler Harmattan months. Tayo shook his head as a reprimand to his flight of fantasy. He looked again at the woman and considered going to say hello. But then someone else appeared. The man looked older than her, perhaps in his 50s or 60s. He greeted the bartenders in Hausa, and, from the enthusiastic replies, Tayo guessed the man to be a regular and probably wealthy. No doubt a high-ranking military officer in civilian clothes. They were the rich ones these days. He wore white shorts, a blue polo neck shirt, and loafers of a style and quality that looked imported. The couple embraced, she shyly, he less so. He grasped her buttocks and kissed her on the lips. The businessmen stopped talking, and the barman was no longer humming as the couple came to the bar and ordered 2 beers. Tayo was thinking of how things used to be with Miriam, when he felt a tap on his shoulder and jumped. "Professor Ajayi?" "Hawa," he replied, hoping she'd not seen him observing the other couple. He bought her a drink, apologizing for Mr. Peter's absence. "What happened?" Hawa touched Tayo's hand lightly, startling him with its suggestion of intimacy. It was a young hand, smooth and cool to the touch. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "I'm fine." He placed his other hand on top of hers to pat it gently as best he could, in a fatherly, professorial way. Chapter 26. He had come to his office early that afternoon to mark papers submitted the previous year. Much of 1993 had been disrupted by strikes and campus closures, but he hoped against all odds that the new year would be different. He had asked his students to consider the Indian National Congress in the 1940s. He wanted them to consider the spokesmen, Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah, and their respective views regarding religious tensions in India at the time. He saw many parallels between the Indian and Nigerian experience and hoped his students would find the same, extrapolate, and discuss. But the papers were disappointing. At best, students summarized text, and at worst, like the one he now read, they plagiarized. It frustrated him to find undergraduates writing in this way, but he understood why. Students could not be expected to study when the physical conditions in which they lived were so appalling. Rooms designed to house 2 now took 6 or more, and the library, once well stocked and up to date, resembled a museum with a handful of torn and dusty exhibits. And this was why he felt so compelled to write even more against the injustices that he saw all around him. His family thought him reckless, and BC sent him several angry letters, warning that his outspoken views could endanger not only himself but others. He felt tempted to write back and tell her to save her anger for her drunken husband, a much greater menace to the family than he could ever be, but he knew BC wouldn't listen to him. She never did. He knew things were dangerous. She didn't need to tell him this, and he was careful. A new decree gave soldiers the right to detain suspects without charge, and he had no intention of disappearing without seeing his Kemi again. Tayo straightened the remaining stack of papers and stood up to stretch. He glanced at his watch. It was late and his head hurt. Time to go home. Not that there was anyone waiting for him there. These days, even his brothers and sisters had stopped asking him to take care of their children, and Hawa was away visiting relatives in Abuja. Though he missed Hawa's company, he did not miss her demands. She was bright, but immature and petulant at times. He'd begun to wish that she would find someone else, someone she could marry, which was what she wanted. Tayo ran his hands over the faded pictures that hung above his desk. Here was an old postcard he had brought back from Oxford, with the colours of the Oriole now looking brown rather than the original bright white and yellow. He'd read somewhere that the Oriole made its last voyage around West Africa in 1974, which coincided with the time when he saw the hopes of African nationalism begin to fizzle. Perhaps the ship's departure was a sign of the times to come, which would make an interesting story for his students, more gripping perhaps than the Indian National Congress. One could start with the making of the ship and the British company that built it. For what purposes were these ships constructed, and what of the slave ships that preceded them? The Oriole was now laid up in Elias Bay, waiting to be broken up for scrap metal. Soon it would be gone, and another marker of West Africa's history would be buried along with all the stories and desires engendered by the ship. Tayo imagined that few would remember the way white colonial officers once looked so condescendingly at other white travellers, and how they in turn glared back in contempt at those pretending to be the African Raj. Few would remember the shock of Africans watching Europeans getting drunk at sunrise, and the even greater shock of finding some of their own providing cheap entertainment at ports, diving like dogs playing fetch-it for coins tossed into the water by the Europeans. Perhaps it was better that some of these memories be buried. Nobody knew where the ship would be taken for its final and ignoble death, but the guess was the ship-breaking shores of Alang, which brought the story back to India. Tayo sighed as he put down the postcard and looked at all the other pictures pinned to the wall. The rest were Kemi creations, hanging loosely on dry bits of sellotape. "My child, my dear child," he murmured to himself. "You are grown up now. What are you doing on this Friday night? Are you with your mother, or have you gone out with friends? Look after your mother, my child. See that she is happy until I come." He sighed again, wishing that he could talk with his daughter, but they hardly spoke these days, not in letters, not even on the phone. Miriam told him that Kemi felt abandoned, but he never knew whether she was projecting her own feelings or whether this was really how Kemi felt. Sometimes he thought of writing to his daughter, to reassure her and explain that he was not abandoning her. But how could he write of these things when Kemi hadn't mentioned them herself? Tayo shut his door and locked it. 5 years had passed since Miriam and Kemi left, and 2 years since he'd seen them last. "Too long," he muttered, walking down the corridor and then outside, where he caught the last glimmer of iridescent light. Only in Jos had he known such shimmering light after the rains, which cheered him as he nodded absently to the night watchman. "Professor!" The guard jumped from his seat to salute. "Good night," Tayo replied, shivering a little. The temperature had suddenly dropped. When he started the car, he noticed that the petrol gauge was low, a reminder to queue for petrol tomorrow. He would wake up early at some ungodly hour, 4 or 5 in the morning, to drive to Dogundutsi Mobile Station, where he heard there was fuel. How crazy that a country exporting millions of gallons of oil each day had none for its own people. Tayo shook his head. It throbbed now, and his arms felt like lead weights. He rested his head for a moment on the steering wheel, but it didn't help. Still the same searing pain. Further down the road he saw a roadblock, one of the many popping up all over the place these days. Sometimes the soldiers would just peer into the car and wave you on, but usually they wanted money and would delay a driver with questions, holding out for the biggest possible bribe. Tayo recalled a time when this sort of thing never happened, when bribes were not the norm and professors were treated with respect. "Good evening," Tayo said, winding down his window. "Good evening, sir," replied the soldier, wielding a rifle. "Where you dey go?" "Home." "Make I see driver license," the soldier barked. Tayo took it from the glove compartment and handed it to the man, who looked at it and then walked off. Another soldier returned with the license. "Professor, we go take you for questioning now." "For what?" "You no fit here. For questioning." The soldier pointed his rifle into the half-open window. Tayo hesitated. "Get out," the soldier shouted, gesturing with his gun for Tayo to step out of the car. "I refuse to get out of this vehicle without being told why." "Come out!" the soldier shouted, pulling Tayo from his seat. Tayo looked around to see if he knew anyone in the cars behind him, but there was no one, so he surrendered his keys as ordered and got into the back seat where he was sandwiched between 2 soldiers. One clamped a hand around the back of Tayo's neck and thrust his head down. As they sped away, Tayo prayed for the first time in years. The soldier had loosened his grip so that he could breathe, but he dared not raise his face. He tried to guess where they were taking him from the turns they took and the condition of the road, but he quickly became disorientated and began to think of how long it would be before people noticed he was missing. The houseboy would not raise the alarm, and nor would his family, who were used to him being away. Perhaps someone at the university might notice his absence, but then there was so much chaos there that he doubted it. He began to think he should have thought of something earlier. His reactions had not been quick enough. Would Hawa worry if she didn't hear from him? His only hope was that someone had seen what had happened. Fellow writers would notice within a day or two that he was quiet, but a day or two might be too long. The car stopped suddenly, and the soldier holding his neck let go, allowing him to sit up and get out. It was dark outside and ominously quiet. Tayo made out several rectangular buildings that looked like school buildings or dormitories, army barracks. One had lights on, and that seemed to be where they were taking him. He thought of making a dash for it, but to where? A foolish idea. They let him in, releasing his arms as they marched him to a room where another soldier sat behind a desk. The men saluted and left. "Sit," the officer ordered, grinning a gap-toothed smile. There was nowhere to sit. "Sit," the man bellowed. Tayo knelt on the ground, crossing his legs to hide his trembling. "Yes, that's right," the officer laughed. "I'm the professor now. Sit on the floor like we used to do at nursery school. Remember those days?" "You have no right to detain me," Tayo snapped. "Let me remind you, Professor, that here you have no power, and I would advise you to watch that tongue of yours. You hear? You hear?" He banged both fists on the desk. "Yes," Tayo muttered. "You have been warned to stop your incendiary activities, and yet you have not." "What incendiary activities?" Tayo asked, anger making him brave. "Are you trying to mock me?" "No," Tayo answered, cowering as the soldier thumped a pistol onto the table. "Good, much better. I think you know very well about the articles you are publishing and those lectures you are giving. Who is giving you the right to be disrespectful?" "It's not a question of respect. It's a question of—" "A question of what?" the soldier shouted. He stood up and walked towards Tayo, his boots stopping just inches from Tayo's knee. "A question of what?" he sneered. "It's a question of wanting the best for our country," Tayo replied, as calmly as he could. "You think we don't know best?" "I think—" "No, you don't think, and that's your problem," the soldier interrupted, walking back to his desk to retrieve his pistol. "Anything more to say?" Tayo said no with a shake of his head. "So I'm going to call my men to remove you, but if we hear one more thing—" He lifted the gun and pointed it at Tayo. "Pa!" he shouted, laughing as Tayo jumped. Then came the beating. As Tayo begged for mercy, one of the soldiers paused for a moment, only to then strike him with his pistol, which sent Tayo crashing to the floor, but not before Tayo's face banged against the table in front of him. Tayo felt sharp, crushing pains in his side and back as they kicked him. He kept screaming, but soon no sound came from him, and as he looked up, something bright and strangely beautiful exploded in his head. When he opened his eyes, he was cowering in a corner, and there was nobody else in the room. I won't write any more," he whispered, cradling his knees until he heard someone coming. He clenched his fist, bracing himself. The footsteps stopped. "Please," Tayo pleaded. "Ogasa, Nami, Nuhu." Tayo looked up and saw his houseboy. "Ogasa, you dey for house. Na malaria, wey dey make you dream one kind." It slowly dawned on Tayo that he was in his own home again. "Where are the soldiers?" Tayo whispered, hiding his face behind his hands. "Dem bring you come for house. When dem see, say you no drive well and enter accident for road." "Is that all?" Tayo murmured. Could Nuhu not see that they had beaten him?